Thank you very much for the generous introduction and, of course, for the invitation. As a policymakers, I have no doubt in Poland that we first have to head for a capitalistic market economy, and then which has to be open. So I was a practitioner of globalization, and we started in 1990 with unilateral trade opening, which is pretty rare in the world history, and it worked. Now, this was not based on a blind faith. It was based on my hobby, on the socialism, which meant to study what works and what fails in the economic growth. It seemed to be completely useless then in the 70s and 80s, but because of the collapse of socialism, it was very useful in launching Poland's economic reforms. What I would like to say is not my memories about Poland's transformation, but my view based on studying other people's papers on the discussion about globalization. And I will keep to the minimum the definitions. As you can see, we have various components of globalization. And I think one of the most important, if not the most important in the modern era, is globalization of communication, which underlies largely modern trade globalization. Globalization of services is contained, so to say, in other globalization flows. And let me only add one thing. Certain kinds of globalization are more important than the other kinds because they are very closely relating to catching up on poor countries, and one should distinguish between those who are especially important, like FDI, like trade in manufacturing, like migration of skilled labor from, let's say, pure financial flows, or especially if they finance budget deficits of the states. Now, this is, now, I think there are 3 points of view in discussing globalization as other developments. One is economic analysis. Another one is political economy. And the third one is ethical, which should not be confused with moralizing. And let me discuss very briefly. Now, the first one is assessing socio-economic consequences of trade or financial opening. I am coming to that, but we should always remember one check. Every sensible analysis is comparative. So to focus, for example, as is typical in the West, recently on so-called losers of globalization is a distorted view, which fuels anti-globalization sentiments. So one has, in speaking about globalization, one should take a global view. And this is pretty rare. Now, one should remember that mainstream economics, at least until recently, has displayed what they call the status bias. In justice, we speak under the rule of law of a presumption of innocence. What was the discussion about economy? It should be presumption of economic freedom, and not the presumption of the state, meaning that whatever problem there is, it is up to the state to fix it. This is extreme, old-fashioned, but very popular view until this day. And mainstream economics is littered with bad doctrines. Until recently, I remember many prominent economists advocating socialism, which means a ban on private ownership and on markets. And I remember how the doctrine of import substitution was very popular until recently in the mainstream economics. And I remember status recommendation of the World Bank. So I repeat, economics should take a presumption of economic freedom and not presumption of the state intervention. Now, and I think that there are some misunderstandings or fallacies in the more sophisticated discussion on globalization when they are not global. Now, in the political economy analysis, one tries to link political outcomes to other factors, rightly or wrongly, including linking them to socio-economic factors. But one should remember that political economy analysis is even more shaky than economics, because the role of chance factors, like appearing of special individuals, is great, and this cannot be predicted. And the second remark would be that one should avoid generalizing from special countries and events like Trump in the US. This should not be, this is very unfortunate, to be sure, what has been happening, especially on the rhetoric under President Trump, but this is not necessarily typical of other regions and other countries. And I think this is something we can discuss. And finally, the moral analysis deals with the moral standards of judging outcomes and has nothing to do with moralizing. And I would distinguish three kinds of more ethical judgments. First, I would call nationalistic. The second is universal. And the third is utopian. So to focus on only one country with disregard of other countries is a display of nationalistic ethic. I am not saying one just by criticizing this ethic one can be effective in stopping it, but we should realize that, for example, narrowing down outcomes of globalization to alleged or true so-called losers and disregarding the winners in the poor countries is a display of nationalistic ethic. Universal ethic can be linked to every large religion, including Christianity, and it's a very difficult ethic. But we should remember that if you take a global view of globalization, then we can refer to a mass of data which shows, for example, here, that the winners from trade globalization have been more numerous among the poor than among the richest individuals. And finally, that we have been witnessing an unprecedented reduction in the number of poor people. By the way, poverty should be defined not by relative numbers, but by absolute poverty. Otherwise, one mixes up two very different concepts. I am not saying that this is only due to globalization. I'm saying that this is the result of market reforms, which including external opening. But what I call utopian is pretty popular among what is called the left, which demands that people are guided by altruism and condemns the markets as a display of non-altruistic morality. Obviously, it is a utopian, but pretty influential, and one should be aware of that. Why? Because we are also dealing with a crude anti-globalism. This is not my main topic. But I think one should mention, because crude ideologies, which are based on hateful emotions, can be very influential, because they appeal to the masses. Fascism has appealed to the masses. Socialism was extremely popular in the 19th century in developed countries. The Social Democratic Party of Germany in the second half of the 19th century have over 1 million members, and was the strongest party in numerical terms. So this is why I'm mentioning it, and one can distinguish two kinds of crude anti-globalism, the one which is based on strongly nationalistic ethic, as for example displayed in the rhetoric of President Trump. America first means everybody second, because if everybody is losing. And we have anti-capitalist propaganda, which is based on nonsensical and completely unrealistic, universal utopian ethic, which is quite influential among the younger people. So the conclusion is that one should be aware, and professional economists should be aware of that too, and should not fuel this inadvertently by focusing on what they conceive the losers in their own countries, and on inequality, which usually does not distinguish between inequality of wealth or income and inequality of opportunity, and does not distinguish between inequality of income and poverty. And poverty is the right goal to focus on. But what is the main cause of mass poverty when it exists? Bad regimes. And bad regimes are anti-market regimes. And anti-market regimes are always despotic. So the dream of democratic socialism is a nonsense. It's a very popular slogan. It's like saying vegetarian hyena. It's so inconsistent. Okay. Well, I would recommend to everybody which is interested in this crude anti-globalist, still very refreshing book of Martin Wolf, the main economic commentator of Financial Times, and this is just a sample of the fallacies he's destroying in his book. I am not going to discuss it. We can to return this in the face of the debate. I only would like to repeat that one should not disregard what appears to us crude and nonsensical, because it may appeal to the masses. And propaganda based on hateful emotions can be effective if it is not neutralized by very strong and professional communication. Professional economists should be wary of not fueling crude anti-globalism, as it is sometimes the case. Now I will briefly discuss more sophisticated discussions about globalization, focusing on trade globalization and financial globalization. And needless to say, this is to be with the bird's eye, because I would like to leave at least 20 minutes for what is usually the most interesting part, which is the discussion. Okay. First, let me move to a small, simple diagram, which I found it useful, which I sketched to discuss globalization. So popular attention is focusing on various outcomes, social, economic, which are due to the combination and interactions of various factors. And analytical task is to disentangle, to isolate the main causes of specific outcomes. And this is an ongoing research. Now, I think it's very useful to distinguish between two kinds of policies while discussing globalization. The first one, call it policy one, opening. Moving from isolation to opening, from less opening to more opening on trade and on finance. The second one are institutions in policies which determine individuals' adjustment to new possibilities or to new threats. And finally, we have the link from outcomes, social economic outcomes to political outcomes. And of course, there is a most powerful factor in the longer run determining economic growth and other outcomes, which is a technical change. And this in itself very strongly depends on institutional system. I don't think there is a doubt there is no good substitute for the regimes which displayed a large extent of economic freedom within the framework of the rule of law. I don't find any example which would strongly falsify this statement. So let me move to the discussion of trade globalization. First, as it was mentioned in the introduction by Professor Fair, one cannot discuss the change in the contemporary world, including globalization, without discussing a tremendous change in the former socialist countries. And it started with China in the late 70s. And then it was the former Soviet bloc between 89 and 91. Poland happened to be the first country to move to independence and to reforms. Because the collapse of socialism, which was a great event, meant that ways toward better system were opened, and this movement to the better system always including opening. Socialism was autarkic, and we in the former Soviet bloc traded with each other. There is very few financial and trade links with the West. So opening, which happened, as I said, in the late 70s and then 10 years later in the former Soviet bloc, was extremely important for the increases in globalization. Now, this is just illustration. What has changed? On the left side, you have an increase, a change in the contribution to the world exports by the former socialist countries, including China. And in case of China, you have a tremendous change, which largely explains why the shares of more developed countries have decreased, except for Germany. You can see that Poland, for example, moved very strongly towards opening. This is trade opening. This is on the right side. Yes. And in these terms, Poland is more open than Spain. And this has happened during 20, 30 years. And this was based on the surge in export of manufacturers within the framework of global value chain. Without new technology, it would be much less. But you maybe look, well, I always find it interesting, Greece, how close the economy is Greece in terms of commodities, not services. So there must be some informal barriers to trade in Greece, even though Greece is formally a free member of the European Union. So a tremendous change, which is a very positive change from the point of view of what sort of a system existed in China and in the former Soviet bloc. When I speak about China, I am not praising this police state. I am praising economic openness, which increased individual freedom. So this is the discussion of what has happened. And we have been witnessing an interaction of opening policies in the former socialist countries and a modern ICT-based technology. So this is an interaction. But as I mentioned, the outcomes, which are wrongly or rightly ascribed to globalization, depend not only on opening, but they also depend on policies which determine the adjustment. Institutions and policies determine the adjustment of individuals, which means possibilities and incentives. And if adjustment policies are poor, then given the opening, you may have many losers, at least in relative terms. By the way, you cannot avoid losers in relative terms. When you move from socialism, which was a very bad system, to free market, you were bound to have some relative losers. For example, party apparatchiks were losers. Or miners, which were privileged under socialism, because under socialism you could not produce and export sophisticated manufacturing goods were losers. So if you care about losers in the relative terms, you tolerate the worst regimes. So one should always remember in what sense one is sympathizing with the losers. And I repeat, one should not forget people who benefited from globalization, especially if they are poor people. And the number of poor beneficiaries hugely exceeds the number of people who are rightly or wrongly perceived as losers in the developed economies, including especially the US. And the share of these losers is largely determined not only by policies of opening, but policies of adjustment. And there's a very interesting, there's an ongoing research on adjustment, which shows, for example, how many barriers to adjustment there are in the United States, including barriers to mobility in spatial or occupational sense, and how incentives have been weakened by certain welfare payments. And also education. You cannot move to better positions if education is poor. But remember, education is quasi-public monopoly. So don't blame the markets for poor outcomes if it is public quasi-market economy which fails. Okay, now I preempted a little my debate, but I would like to make a comparison which I found very interesting. China and India. It is how barriers, bad adjustment policies and institutions limit gains from globalization in the case of poor countries. As you can see, at the beginning, 92, per capita income was more or less the same in these two giants. But then China moved much faster. And why China has moved much faster, even though India has liberalized to some extent its economy, reduced barriers? Because in China, many more poor people moved from agriculture to manufacturing. And they moved from the rural areas, at least temporarily, to towns. While in India, there have been many barriers to this mobility. And this is why India has such a small share in manufacturing. First, there are still barriers between provinces in India or states. One cannot move freely. Second, extremely poor education. Third, extremely poor infrastructure. Third, subsidies which demobilize people from moving. Subsidies, fuel subsidies to poor farmers. Subsidies to the various losers. And finally, extremely restrictive labor laws, which are similar to the ones in Greece. This has been Indian socialism, which discourage people from hiring new entrants, new people in manufacturing. So this shows how bad adjustment policies reduce gains to the poor people in a poor country. Well, I already mentioned that I perceived a bias in the popular discussion and among some academics in a sense of focusing on what they call the globalization losers. Without being specific, to what extent it is due to bad policies. And this may fuel anti-globalization backlash. There is a lot of academic research which tries to disentangle the relative role of technology and of import competition in creating what is called, inverted commas, the losers. But this is not important, most important thing. What is more important is that this focus on the losers to some extent and the moral condemnation, which is over-associated with focusing on the losers, reminds me of morality of Middle Ages, when competition was condemned and creative destruction was conceived as reprehensible. Now, this has changed in 19th century with the market revolution, but it appears to me that some analysts are going back. I am not saying one should not care about the losers in developed economies, but in caring, one should not fuel anti-globalism, and one should not forget, once again, about poor people in poor countries. But most importantly, instead of bashing trade globalization, one should focus on policies which prevent or limit individuals' adjustment. And there are many of these policies. They should be the focus of attention of analysts, of policy analysts in the West or everywhere. So I already said that. Okay. Now I move to financial globalization, which is even more contested. And frankly speaking, I find the number of fallacies even greater than the one in discussion of the trade policies. And it's so easy to bash financial globalization because then you point out to these awful large corporations as culprits. You bash the lack of proper supervision, which is true, but this is bashing the symptoms. The main point is, as in the case of trade globalization, that the focus is on the symptoms and not on the causes. And analysts should focus on the causes. And causes are largely policies, bad policies. I find there are similar biases in discussing the financial globalization. First, it is disregarding the role of bad policies in contributing to what is conceived to be bad outcomes, and second, disregarding benefits. So if you disregard both, we are bound to blame the symptoms. Now, let me start with some basics. I think it is largely taken for granted in textbooks, in mainstream economics, in popular discussion, that crises are bad because they mean a deep interruption in economic activity, a deep recession going beyond normal recessions, and this is true, this is correct. The problem is that the deepest crises have occurred under non-market economies. But when you focus on crises under capitalism, and especially on the financial crisis, you inadvertently convey the message that the markets are wrong. But look at the deepest crisis in the non-market economies, and the deepest crises are by far the deepest ones. Just an example, Maoism, Great Leap Forward, a collapse. This was genocide, like Cultural Revolution. Why such policies were possible? And this is only one example. You may refer to Stalinism, you may refer to Khmer Rouge. Why? Because of extreme concentration of political power. And it is the extreme concentration of political power which is the main reason for the deepest crisis. And you find many, many examples of that. So if people focus only on crisis under capitalism, they display a lack of comparative approach. And by lacking of comparative approach, one is likely to have biased recommendations or biased observations. So the simple conclusion is that the most important safeguard against bad policies, including those which produce very deep crises, is a division of power in the society, not only in the state, but in the society, which includes a strong presence of a private sector within the rule of law. Then you have a dispersion of decisions. And you do not run the risk of a despot who is sadist, psychopath, or just crazy. And the despot does not face any constraints, by definition. Okay, but I think that the popular discussion about the causes of the financial crisis under capitalism is very superficial, because usually, or quite often, it disregards the role of policies. The popular textbooks, including Kindleberger, present the financial crisis as though they were a regular feature of capitalistic economy, which would imply that the incidence of financial crisis is more or less equal across time and space, which is not true. This is very unequal, and we have very new studies which show how and why the incidence of financial crisis has been so unequal. And these studies, I just mentioned some others, point out to policies which contribute to financial crisis by distorting incentives of the financial participants. For example, encouraging excessive risks by creating moral hazard, like too big to fail, like excessively low interest rate, etc., etc. Now, financial crisis becomes global when it includes a globally important economy, which nowadays is the US, perhaps China, when it's going to have a crisis, financial crisis, would cause a global financial. But with respect to the US, it's a ample literature pointing out to the policy errors which have contributed to the crisis, which has then spread to other countries. But there are certain misleading metaphors that are very popular in academic literature, in popular literature, like domino effect, which is a physical analogy, or contagion, which is a biological, medical analogy. Metaphors are misleading because they would imply that everybody will be affected, which is not true. What country is affected by shocks from other countries depends on institutions and policies. So it's not like a blind force which spreads and affects everybody. But it starts in a globally important countries, for example, what is called the recent global financial crisis has not affected Poland because we are prudent enough not to emulate Mr. Greenspan in the National Bank of Poland, and has not very much affected Germany, which did not go on a mortgage credit spree. So look at the policies in discussing so-called global crisis. Now, I would like to mention, and this I'm approaching to end my presentation, that there are various kinds of financial crises which can be fueled by global shocks. I found it useful, especially in discussing the crisis in the Eurozone, to distinguish what I called financial fiscal crisis. It starts with a private credit boom, which is almost always mortgage credit. And why mortgage credit has been so much increasing during the last 30, 50 years can be linked to policies. Now, these policies fuel the credit boom. Everybody's happy until there is a bust. Then everything goes into reverse. Fiscal surplus turns into deep deficit, and this spills over to the economy, causing deep recession and the explosion of the budget deficit, which is the Spain story. But at the beginning, you have policies. This is Greek story, generalized Greek story. You have a fiscal boom fueled by imprudent cross-banking lending, which fuels the economy. When it stops and reverses, there is a financial crisis because Greek banks lended to Greek government. But where are the deeper reasons? Political economy. The populist, which governed for almost 20 years or more years in Greece. So one has to look to what sort of constraints one should create in order to avoid fiscal booms. So I already discussed that. I have to go back. I think okay, I've lost. Okay, now let me end with some points, some observations, or perhaps recommendation. First, once again, one should distinguish between globalization as a symptom and policies which determine the outcomes, including policies of opening, but especially policies which determine adjustment. And if adjustments are poor because of policies and institutions, this may spill over to political outcomes. What is the policy recommendation then? Go back on opening or improve adjustment. Pick your choice. Secondly, even if you have some negative political outcomes which are linked to globalization, one should not generalize from one case, as it is often done with respect to US. I don't think we have such an intensive, strong backlash against trade in the European Union, unfortunately. There are some resistance, there are more resistance to immigration for right or wrong reasons, but not so much against trade. Third, I think that European Union, together with some Asian countries, can play the role of a center of defending trade globalization and moving towards trade globalization. Fourth, economists should be wary of the use or misuse of their analysis which focus on inequalities or so-called losers in rich countries if they do not give the global view of the winners in poor countries. And finally, we have to distinguish analytical work, which is very important, from communication, which should be based on good analytical work, but it has its own requirements. We can only face anti-globalization tendencies if you are better on communication. So by ending on personal note, I stopped writing longer essays. I am now mostly on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much for this speech, which contained some provocative statements, I guess, for some people here, and that can fuel the discussion. The floor is now open for discussion, so please raise your hand. So the first one is Ralf Ossa from the University of Zurich. So Ralf, maybe is there a microphone here? So somebody should give him here. It's here in the first.
Yeah, thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. You talked a lot about the importance of adjustment policies, and I mean that seems seems very plausible. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on what concrete policies you think might be most effective.
Well, I can only rely on what I've read. I would recommend a recent review in The Economist. This is 21st, and there are other more academic papers. Now, first of all, I think one has to make an analysis what works wrongly. And here I should distinguish limits to possibilities and policies which weaken incentives for people to move. On the possibilities, I think, and I am only naming the policies, education in some countries, I think one reason why Switzerland or Germany have making much smoother adjustment is the education system, which is widely praised, and the one in the US is perceived to produce many mismatches, mismatches. Of course, it's easier for smaller countries to have better education system without the inequality, but certain education. Then spatial mobility, restrictive zoning, as it is the case in Britain or in some regions of the US, limit mobility. And sometimes you have to move. It's not easy to rebuild depressed localities. So spatial mobility, to my knowledge, is declined even in the US. By the way, restrictive zoning contributes to wealth inequalities because wealthy people have their real estate protected, no intruders. And what fuels the prices? Unconventional monetary policy, which continues until this day. So certain policies which are widely praised, rightly or wrongly, have negative consequences from the point of view of mobility. Then there are sometimes local policies, or regional policies, which limit the movement of people. Excessive minimum wages, which may be regional, may limit the productive occupation, and everything which makes it profitable not to work. Subsidies to individuals, to depressed sectors, to depressed towns, to depressed firms. It sounds very humanistic to help, but if you help with subsidies, you hurt in the longer run. And finally, I've noticed there's an ongoing research on what policies work and what do not. Brookings Institution's recent study is focusing on that.
Okay, other questions? Lenny, just next to you.
You described the important gains that China made in recent decades under globalization, and as you rightly said, it was remarkably successful in terms of poverty alleviation, and clearly globalization had something to do with it. But one looks at the way that China did it. It seems that there were many things that they did which doesn't quite fit in sort of our understanding today of the usual rules of globalization. They remained fairly protected until relatively late. They did not join the World Trade Organization until later. The government retained significant state ownership. They engaged in a very wide range of industrial policies. They protected state enterprises to protect employment. They, of course, still manage the capital flows, and they manage the currency. So in many ways, China played the globalization game by rules that were very different than the ones that prevailed after the 1990s, almost more like under the Bretton Woods rules, where countries were expected to manage their economies, and there was a much bigger role for the state. All of this, even though, as you said, they moved towards the market, but it wasn't anything like sort of embracing globalization, for example, the way that a country like Mexico did, or many other Latin American countries did. So my question is, do you think China would have been better off, starting from the late 1970s, doing a much clearer break with the past, and having a sort of starting with a drastic opening on the import side, privatizing enterprises, opening itself to financial globalization in a much quicker way? You think China would have been better off in its performance?
Well, that's a very important question, which I have met before. Now, how do we judge a certain policies? We should not judge it by comparing it with certain ideal. So completely free market policies, and if something deviates from free market, then it will be interpreted as not being really liberalizing. I think it is a wrong judgment. The correct judgment is to measure the change. In the case of China, in the late 70s, you have a completely closed and destroyed economy by excessive Maoism. And then you have extreme opening. Some people call China gradualism, but I think it's a misnomer because they started with largely liberalizing agriculture, which accounted for the most economy. They abandoned nonsensical Maoist communes. There was a huge change, even though it falls short of a certain ideal, but it doesn't matter. The change matters. It was an enormous change. And then they allowed migration, and they allowed de facto privatization of the economy, never called privatization because it's a forbidden name. I remember when I was a central banker in Poland, I invited my colleague from China, the governor of central bank, to deliver a speech, and he said, in China, we are introducing a socialist market economy. And then he added, in some provinces, every enterprise is already private. So, distinguish between official speech and reality. If you look at the data, most of the economy is in the private hands or quasi-private hands in China. That's true that they have still state-owned enterprises, which are the drag, according to the research I know, because they're heavily subsidized by state-owned banks. So if you regard subsidization of loss-making enterprises a bad thing, which I do, then you could conclude that China would have been better if it went for quicker privatization, not only via the creation of new private enterprise, but by transforming the state-owned enterprises. There has been a tremendous opening in China, but along the mode of export-oriented growth and not so much free trade, but still it delivers enormous economic benefits. So first, China has achieved successes by abandoning the most extreme system, which was socialist, statist system, by moving toward markets. China has not reached an ideal of free market, but has made an enormous change in the direction of economic freedom. This does not mean that I think its political system is good. The political system is very bad, according to our Western standards. But one has to see the economic differences in this case. I think some of these unconventional policies in China, which were praised, brought about a lot of negative consequences, like corruption, this dual price system. When they moved initially, they wanted to preserve a dual system. Central planning and markets, there was a lot of corruption.
Okay, there is a question here. Other questions? Okay.
My name is Stefan Björklund. I'm a Swedish national. And I have studied the Chinese experiment, and also in my youth I studied the socialist economy of Poland with Bermuda Triangles in economy. What we can see today in China after the last Party Congress, it seems to me to be a reverse back from the new economic policy or perestroika towards a more Stalinist type of economy. Do you agree with this?
Well, I can only judge based on what I read, and based on what I read, I agree. This is a worrisome evolution towards more political despotism, perhaps abandoning a political reform which was a fixed tenure for the main ruler. And the question arises to what extent China would deal with the looming problems. And I think the most important problem is a threat of financial crisis. China is not above economic growth. And the rate of growth of credit to GDP in China, largely fueled to loss-making enterprises, was tremendous. Secondly, China has to slow down even without the crisis, because first, one of the drivers of economic growth in China, which was a large number of new entrants to the labor market, which moved from less to more productive sector, has been exhausted. So the further growth would depend on productivity growth. And productivity growth demands more market reforms. You cannot have productivity growth by picking up winners by the politicians, which seems to be now, again, fashionable. So I expect first visible slowdown in China, and I would not rule out a crisis in China. And then the question arises, if the tensions, if there are economic problems, what policy would fuel it? Nationalism, perhaps.
There was a question over there in the middle.
Thank you very much. My name is Martin Hagersberg. You argued in favor of mobility and you argued in favor of good policies. So I think we can say that the recent migratory crisis is the result of bad policies in combination with mobility. So how to handle the mobility away from bad policies from African countries?
I think, economically speaking, the most important, and not only economically speaking, socially speaking, the most important question is whether new migrants would be absorbed into the labor market. If they are not absorbed, they are going to be frustrated. And you would have banlieue in various places. So one has to look to policies in the host countries and see to what extent there are barriers to absorption. And then you would look at excessive minimum wages in some countries, formally or informally, to informal discrimination sometimes, etc., etc.
There have been a question. There's somebody there who wants to say something.
Hello, I want to pick up on your statement that those big crises happened because of the concentration in power, politics, or economics. And I want to know your thoughts about the current development that those huge countries are getting bigger and bigger. And yes, what do you think about the current development in economics, the concentration of power?
But what countries are getting bigger and bigger? Some countries want to get smaller.
Companies,
companies.
In economic terms, yes.
I can only refer you to this brilliant book of Martin Wolf, which discusses also a popular claim that corporations are very dangerous and they threatened the government. This is based on some misleading comparisons and figures, and disregards enormous benefits to countries which can provide good institutional environment for foreign direct investment. One should not rely in judging corporations on Hollywood movies. You know, they are very popular. Hollywood, at every second Hollywood movie demonizes large corporations. And it's silent on despots. You have the Hollywood directors who, like Oliver Stone, who is very fond of making movies about dictators. First Fidel Castro, then Putin. So don't judge corporations based on Hollywood movies.
There has been somebody here. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Hans-Peter Martin. You were referring a lot to this necessity of the strength of the institutions and the division of power. Can I ask you a question in regard to how you look at the country where you grew up today in these aspects?
Okay, I am fighting what is going on now in Poland. This is why, as I said, I am on Twitter. In my category on non-entertainment guy, I am faring pretty good. As I said, I have almost 300,000 people follow, and on Facebook, 100,000. There is civic resistance, civil society organizations. And remember, if I have to discuss it a little more broadly, that this is a part of what may call start of a better transition after free elections. It is in Turkey, in a much more drastic form, and Orban in Hungary, much earlier under Putin. And there may be various combination of factors which bring about such a change. The most important thing is to resist as early as possible. And this is what we are doing in Poland.
So may I add to this
Please.
question? Because you showed us these graphs where that illustrate the impressive opening of Poland and other Eastern European countries to the world economy. But at the same time, one gets the impression right now that, at least in public opinion, that the resistance, the political resistance towards further opening or against foreigners and politicians that want to open the country further, that are pro-globalization, is very strong now in these countries. Why did this come about? Let's say Hungary, Poland, also partly in Slovakia. So you have a lot of upheaval, political upheaval, where populist parties that are not pro-globalization gained a lot of power.
First, some explanation. First, I don't see any backlash against trade globalization. In Poland and other Central European countries, there is no backlash. There is no backlash against financial globalization. Usually foreign direct investment is popular. So this is not. We have in some countries, you have not a backlash, but protests against immigrants which are not present. In Poland, there are no immigrants. Or we have 1 million immigrants for Ukraine without any, against refugees. And this is the product of hateful propaganda, which works under certain conditions. By the victory, but let me go back, the victory of the present ruling party is not due to any tremendous shift in popular attitudes. One should distinguish between combination of factors which produce certain electoral results and what happened next. In politics, the quality of electoral campaigns matters. Who have foreseen that Trump would win in the US? Yes? And in Poland, it's not so much that the present ruling party has won, but the opposition has lost, because they had a very weak campaign. And they made some blunders in politics by, for example, nationalizing part of funded pensions, and which was against very much what the proponents thought. Finally, two parties in the elections, parliamentary elections in the autumn of 2015, missed threshold by the very small margin. If only one has passed, there would be completely different results. But I'm not questioning the democratic mandate. I'm saying that one should not always try to link it to some universal shifts. Combination of reasons, factors which cause certain causes, political outcomes differ. And then one of the things, I think this is my question, that peculiarities of political situation, I wonder to what extent Trump has won because the concentration of what was people who perceived themselves as losers was very heavy in the swing states. And this is not the case in most other democratic countries. So the detail matters.
There are now 3 questions left, so one here, and one here. I ask you to raise the questions, we collect them, and then Professor Balcerowicz can answer. So it's 1, 2, 3.
My name is Vinay Kalia, and my question is that is globalization reversible? And if yes, what's the worst case scenario for it?
Okay, next question, behind you, just behind you.
Thank you. You mentioned in your presentation key players in the global economy like United States, China, India, European Union, and so on. But you didn't say anything about Russia. Could you please make a short comment
very
on
gladly.
Russian? Thank you.
So there's a further question back there. But this person behind was, I think,
Russia.
the very first. No, raise your hand that we can see you. Yeah, you should get the microphone now because you have waiting for a long time. Sorry.
My question is short. Are Sweden and Denmark vegetarian hyenas?
No.
And then there was somebody else here, so please also ask a question.
How would you approach solving the infrastructure problem in India? Because it also takes a trust in a return of the investment from the individuals, and that's lacking. And also, do you see another thing in the startups? Do you see a change in the nature of startups? Because startups used to be made to become companies, and now it seems to me they are made for something else. And how does that impact on the economy?
So now, you have 4 questions, and try to be short.
I would not pretend I am a specialist on everything, including India. I could only say that it's pretty easy to say what are the necessary or desirable policies, and much more difficult to say how one should change political economy to achieve these policies. On a policy level, it seems to me obvious that one would have to invite more capital, private capital, within the framework of PPP or even private capital, but then one has to have much better framework for the private investment. So we are going to politics. On Sweden, no, Sweden is not socialist unless you define socialism by completely different terms that it was defined by Marx and implemented by Lenin. What was socialism, again, according to these classics? And what was the real socialism? Replacement of private ownership by the monopoly of state ownership, and replacement of market by central planning. So one is introduced a complete elimination of economic freedom. Once you do that, you have to eliminate civil rights, including rights of association and rights of democracy, because people would vote for capitalism sooner or later. So socialism is based on fear. You have to produce fear, intimidation. Now, some people like the word socialist in such a way, it's a sacred word, then say, no, this is not socialist. They say, socialist is in Sweden. Why? What do they imply? Because Sweden has a large welfare state. If you define socialist by welfare state, every OECD economy is socialist, including the US. Because in the US, social spending to GDP is high. It's higher than in Canada. Slightly more high, but it's very badly structured. So it is a nonsensical definition to define, to manipulate the meaning of the word, which has already established interpretation. These are so-called verbal innovations in social sciences, which contribute to confusion. This is not the case of exact sciences. Now, on Russia, Russia had a good start, surprisingly, under under Yeltsin and under Gaidar, but the window of opportunity was much shorter, so they did less reforms. Most oligarchs originated under Gorbachev. And then Yeltsin made a decision. He proposed Putin. Now, Putin assumed power, and he was genuinely popular because economy was at the bottom. It could only get better. It got better, so he became very popular. And he was using this popularity to capture the state, including, first of all, what? KGB. Once he captured the state, there was an end of democracy. And his economic policies are heading towards a more prominent role of gas and oil, which is regarded as a political weapon, and more statism. So nationalizing, not completely, but nationalizing the economy and having favorite oligarchs. Now, this is not a good model for growth. So Russia has been growing very, very slowly, and with this model, Russia cannot grow. It will be very, very slowly, if at all. The growth would be very slow. Is globalization reversible? Well, I cannot say no, even though I would say that one should distinguish between the decline in the globalization ratios, which are due to, so to say, natural causes. For example, the technical change, which could make changes the locations. If you have more robots, you can have more location back in the developed countries, for example, and this is a natural cause. I don't think we should try to stop it. We should worry about policies. Policies of reducing the opening, and this is why one has to act in the media and in politics to try to stop it. And one final word, I think there are so many beneficiaries of globalization who would become losers if there is a setback in globalization policy. So these potential losers have to be mobilized, including under Mr. Trump.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.